In becoming an effective global leader, learning the legal, political, economic aspects of a country or region is important. However, one of the most important aspects to learn is the culture of the new foreign environment you are getting ready to invest in. A successful global leader makes the effort to understand the values and customs of the new market. Learning the language will be great, but often very difficult to do, especially at a later age of life. Over the years, scholars have never been able to agree on a simple definition of culture. In the late 1800s, one anthropologist defined culture as that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and other capabilities acquired by a member of society. Over time, that definition has changed to being a system of values and norms that are shared among a group of people and that when taken together constitute a design for living. So what are the determinants of culture? Carpenter provides some great insights into culture and what it is. But it is often good to reinforce it with other perspectives like from Hill and Hult, Global Business Today, which is reflective in this diagram. The outer circles have 6 determinants that influence culture. Previously, we had discussed political and economic philosophies. These philosophies clearly influence the value systems of society. For example, the values found in Communist North Korea toward freedom, justice, religion, freedom of speech will be very different from the values found in the United States. The reason? They operate under very different philosophies. So why is it important to understand these determinants in the resulting culture? One of the most well-known methods used in describing and learning about other cultures was developed by Gert Hofstede. The interesting aspect is a study was commissioned by IBM, who wanted to understand how culture related to values in the workplace. Originally, the study identified 4 dimensions: power distance, individualism versus collectivism, uncertainty avoidance, and masculinity versus femininity. Due to further research that focused more on Far Eastern values and norms, a 5th dimension was added: long-term versus short-term orientation. If you think about this dimension, it makes sense, as Western societies appear to be more short-term focused, while Far Eastern societies take a longer view. Edward T. Hall is another well-known anthropologist and is best known developing 3 categories that analyze, interpret, how communications and interactions between cultures: context, space, and time. One of the more interesting aspects of his study is how space plays into cultural differences. Some people need more space in all areas. People who encroach into that space are seen as a threat. Personal space is an example of a mobile form of territory, and people need less or greater distance between them. A Japanese person who needs less space thus will stand closer to an American, inadvertently making the American uncomfortable. Some people need bigger homes, bigger cars, bigger offices, and so on. This may be driven by cultural factors that are different than in those in other countries. Communication is a key method of understanding cultural differences. Verbal language and body language are key in understanding the differences between 2 cultures. From personal experience, I have spent over 30-plus years working in many different cultural settings. It was important to not only understand the cultural differences between us, but to accept and not be critical of them. This was especially important as I lived and worked in 4 different countries during those years. While I may never have agreed with some of their cultural practices in these locations, I never criticized them, as I expected them not to criticize my values and norms. One of the biggest dangers confronting a company that is expanding globally for the first time is the danger of being misinformed. When a company is misinformed about the practices of another country, that probability increases dramatically. Conducting business in a different culture requires adaptation to conform to the value system and norms of that culture. Adaptation has to do to embracing all aspects of an international company's operations in a foreign country. Equally important is the need to have a degree of adaptation in the host company of the international company. For example, a company I worked for had a large operation in Argentina, where there were 5 expatriate employees who did not speak Spanish and tried to implement American business practices. After several years, these expatriates were asked to leave the company and the country. Due to my educational and professional background, I was asked to take an expatriate assignment for 2 to 3 years, which I accepted in that company. The very first meeting with my staff at 55 employees, I spoke to them in Spanish, which surprised them. For 5 years, I worked side by side with them and showed them that while I was a gringo and still employed some U.S.-based processes, I was also willing to incorporate the best of their ideas in order to create a world-class finance organization. When I left 5 years later, the CEO publicly stated that a porteño, meaning a local inhabitant, was immigrating to the United States. In their eyes, I had managed to bridge the cultural difference between being a U.S. citizen and an Argentine. That is what successful companies do. They develop a culture that promotes adaptation that is both local and global at the same time. One of the areas that causes the biggest concern is business ethics. The ethical obligations of a multinational corporation toward employment conditions, human rights corruption, and environmental pollution are not always clear-cut. What is becoming clear-cut? Businesses are feeling more marketplace pressures from customers and other stakeholders to be transparent in their ethical decision-making and operations. At the same time, there is no universal, worldwide agreement about what constitutes accepted ethical principles. From an international business perspective, someone argued that what is acceptable depends upon one's cultural perspective. For example, it is considered appropriate and proper behavior to give a gift between parties during business negotiations in Asian cultures. However, in many Western cultures, such a practice would be considered a form of bribery and unethical, especially if the value of the gift is substantial. There are no easy answers to resolve ethical dilemmas that a global leader may face on a daily basis. For now, it is enough to know that ethical dilemmas exist because many world decisions are complex, difficult to frame, and involve first, second, and third-order consequences that are hard to quantify. Doing the right thing, or even knowing what the right thing might be, is difficult enough. This chapter covered a lot of material to digest. Take the time to closely read and comprehend the key concepts, as they will be important to learn and to apply even in your workplace today.